A school in the Midlands is not what usually springs to mind when the name of Christopher Wren is mentioned. And that really is the focus of today's talk. It seems to me that it's a bit odd that it isn't seen as a higher profile link to Christopher Wren, but there are reasons for that, and I hope in this talk I'll show some of the reasons why Wren's involvement in this building is important, and perhaps point to some of the issues which have concealed that from our view in the past. Okay, so this is the building which we're sitting in, of course, the hall in the central part of the building. It was built in the end of the 17th century between 1694 to 1697. So although the building was complete in 1697, it probably didn't really start functioning as a school for a few years after that. We do have the cost of the original expenditure on the school, which was about £3,000. You can try 5 different websites which tell you how to calculate what 17th century money is worth in today's money. They all give different answers, but broadly we're talking about a cost of £250,000 to £300,000, which makes some sort of sense. This is probably an early example of a purpose-built school rather than a school located in a religious college or often in villages in someone's house in the village. It's designed like a country house. I mean, that is the essential appearance of it. So this is the original part from 1697. There is a small extension here, which I suppose is an indication that the school was doing pretty well at that time, that it needed more space in order to function. So the building of it was possible by the donation of this money by Sir John Moore. Now, Moore was born in a neighbouring village in 1620. He went to school in Ashby-de-la-Zouch, which was known in the early 17th century as a place where you were educated in Calvinism within the broad Puritan tradition. In other words, the religious background was the basis on which, as we know, events unfolded during the English Revolution, where Puritanism became quite a dominant religious and political force. At the age of 20, so in 1640, the beginning of the English Civil War, he was apprenticed to the Grocers' Company in London, where he served his apprenticeship probably for the next 10 years or so. His master from Grocers' Company supplied lead to the parliamentary army used as ammunition in the English Civil War. And Moore essentially learned the lead trade from his apprenticeship. And the lead trade was the following. It was mined in Derbyshire and Yorkshire principally. There are a few other places. It was then smelted nearby into pigs or bars. These were then transported to the waterways, which took it to Hull in the northeast of England, and it was then transported by sea to London. The reason for all that elaborate network, of course, was lead was extraordinarily heavy and the roads were in a dreadful state. So it was that route of transportation. And so Moore essentially became the dominant merchant in London with links to the lead producers in the Midlands and was in charge of that trade, and that's where he made his fortune. One of the issues about this religious background, of course, arose with the Restoration in 1660, when being a Puritan and being linked to someone who sold lead for ammunition to the parliamentary army was not a particularly good place to be. You know, there's been a recent novel published called The Act of Oblivion. Well, the Act of Oblivion was a law that was passed around 1660, absolving people like More from any having to pay any penalty. So there was an acceptance that a lot of people had been on a different side to the royalists, but that was okay. However, there was a problem in becoming a political representative, an alderman, which was the most senior political position in London, where you essentially had to conform to the Church of England rather than retain nonconformist beliefs. So More was in a quandary about this. He finally decided that he would do this with the support of a lot of the Puritan community in London, so he wasn't acting alone. And he basically decided to go with Charles II, and so he became part of that, part of the establishment from then on. So he became one of the wealthiest merchants in late 17th century London, though his name is not really known. And he funded 2 schools in the early 1690s. Okay, now I'm really looking at the origin of this school and the thinking behind it rather than what happened to the school subsequently. This has been covered in a book called This Noble Foundation by Richard Dunmore. So broadly, in the 18th century, it was attended by 2,000 pupils, probably about 60 to 100 each year. And at that time, it was a mix of different types of education, which I'll talk about later. In the 19th century, it basically split into 2 separate schools, a grammar school and an English school. The English school was for local education for the local boys. The Latin school was aimed more at the gentry. The grammar school declined in the 19th century, and in the 20th century it was closed, and it became home for the village primary school initially, which then closed down in the 1930s. It was reopened in the 1950s as the Sir John Moore Church of England aided primary school, which now has 140 pupils. So I said it had a sort of country house design. So the key thing to note about is it's an H-plan design. So essentially you have this schoolroom in the middle here. There's a floor above it, which were dormitories for the boarding pupils. And then these 2 wings were a mix of accommodation for the schoolmasters and additional schoolrooms. So let's explore the link with Wren, because this is a bit more contested and complicated than one might imagine. Most of the architectural drawings from Wren's office that survive are kept at All Souls College in Oxford. And there is a catalogue of all these drawings, and one of them are the plans for the Appleby School, which are dated to about 1693. First of all, they were not drawn by Wren himself. They were drawn by Nicholas Hawksmoor. This was quite common for a lot of you. Practically all the drawings for Hampton Court Palace are by Nicholas Hawksmoor. So he was initially a draftsman in Wren's office. He later developed his own architectural career, but therein lies some of the complication. And so you can see this H-plan is very clearly visible on these drawings. So this is the main schoolroom, these are the 2 wings, and then above we have the 2 wings, and these are partitions into the dormitories for the boarding pupils at the school. So Wren was a very different character to John Moore. He was born in the south, in Wiltshire, in 1632. He had an Anglican background rather than a Puritan background. His father, in fact, was Dean of Windsor. He had strong royalist connections. His uncle was imprisoned by Cromwell for 20 years. He was an intellectual prodigy, becoming a professor at the age of 25, and then he was appointed by King Charles as the surveyor of the King Works in 1669. So he has a prestigious career as a renowned architect, best known for his designs of royal buildings and churches. So you couldn't think of someone more different to John Moore than Christopher Wren in terms of their family background, in terms of their religious and political affinities and outlook. There is a surviving letter from Sir Christopher Wren to John Moore about this building. So there's no question that evidence exists to show Wren was involved in the design of this building. This is in 1693. Wren says he missed it more when he was calling him. The design I drew according to your first thoughts presumably refers to those drawings by Hawksmoor, which are in All Souls College. However, he says, if you have new resolutions, I can cast easily a new design suitable to your intention. So in other words, Wren was open to client expectations in terms of the final design. Again, something which is quite common in his buildings. And so there was an issue about the room for boarders, and Wren saying it's not a big deal, it's a floor just above the hall. So those are the design plans from 1693. In 1999, the building was in a bit of a state, and we had to prepare for a major renovation project. And Latham Architects did a survey of the building then. So I'll just broadly compare. You'll see the pattern is very similar. One of the differences is this arcade at the front of the school is not in the original design. And some of these partitions have been lost on the upper floor. But broadly, the layout is similar to the original Wren design. So here we come to an interesting challenge. Historic England lists this building as Grade 1. It was listed in 1952. Grade 1 is the highest listing you can get, so it's as important as Hampton Court Palace, according to this thing. And it says the architect is Sir William Wilson and makes no mention whatsoever of Christopher Wren. So this is an interesting issue. This has taken a bit of investigation, but I suppose I put it down to what I call Colvin's War. Colvin was a very eminent architectural historian who wrote the classic work on the Dictionary of English Architects, originally published in 1954. He had a bit of an obsession that Wren had been given the attribution of far too many buildings. So his personal mission was to question this if there wasn't any evidence. And so he argues that this school is a doubtful case to ascribe to Wren, and claims that the designs were made by Wren, so he's not questioning that. But he says William Wilson completely altered their character in execution. The Guardian had an obituary of Howard Colvin saying that part of his mission to avoid this sort of attribution was to bring to light the achievements of provincial architects. So in other words, recognise more the contribution of a Midlands architect like Sir William Wilson. But in fact, when he talks about William Wilson, he describes him as old-fashioned and second-rate. So he might bring him to light, but it wasn't in a very positive frame. So let's look at what the basis for this is. And it's not about the plan, the layout of the building, which I've shown you has remained very similar. It's about the design of the front elevation. So this was the front of the building originally proposed by Christopher Wren, again drawn by Hawksmoor. And you'll see, although it retains this H plan and the country house appearance and brick and stone, which are characteristics of the building, it has these pitched roofs and it's of a different style. This is the earliest picture that we have of the building as it was built. This is in Nicholl's History of Leicestershire. And you can see that although it also has the H plan, it's got much more severe elevations, and the decorative style is different, and it has a flat roof, and it has an arcade at the front. Interestingly, just three things I'll point out for when you're looking around the building. It has a diamond-shaped clock face, it has a cartouche of Sir John Moore's arms, and it has stone across these arches. None of these are present in the current building, and there's no evidence that they were here and were removed, though they could have been, since it's a long time since it was built. So basically then, you've got this contrast between the preliminary design of Wren and the drawing of the school as built in Nichol's History of Leicestershire. So if you read the architectural historians, a story has been constructed, firstly that the design of the building reflected a provincial architect and his backwardness compared to national style. The curator of the Sir John Soane Museum says it puts the date back by at least half a century, pre-Civil War, an instance of the tenacity of local tradition. Howard Colvin, the appearances of a Jacobean structure of the first half of the 17th century. Richard Dunmore, a good example of the tendency for provincial style to lag some years behind that of the fashionable capital. So, the local architect's influence is seen as backward. Secondly, it's seen as a bit uppity. Originally, the Wren design project was going to be supervised by the master carpenter Thomas Woodstock, who worked with Wren on St Paul's Cathedral. But he died in 1694, and so that's when Wilson took over the project management, if you like, for the construction of the building. So it was left the field clear for Wilson. He took his place as surveyor in charge and proposed drastic alterations to Wren's design. The facades greatly differ from the original design and were due to an ambitious local architect. Wilson was left with a free hand to do more or less as he pleased. Now, this is quite an extraordinary claim. It's suggesting that the project manager, completely redesigned the building. And the implication is without Wren's consent or approval. It seems to me this is a pretty dubious story in the first place. We've seen there is evidence of Wren's involvement. Most of Wren's designs as built differ from early proposals. You look at Wren's drawings for Hampton Court Palace or Greenwich Hospital, they're quite different to what was actually built. And why shouldn't they be? I mean, Wren was a pioneer of the new type of architectural office. It responded to clients' needs. It was flexible and adaptive. It wasn't just insistence on one particular design. So it'd be quite normal if changes were made, which could have been agreed with Wren. This notion of backwardness of style, now this is not my territory, and so I make my observations with care. I use other people's expertise, but it's not clear. And I'd say the consensus in terms of the appearance of the front of the building is pretty positive, which seems odd if it was sort of thrown together by a backward provincial architect who did his own thing. If we look more closely, we see the initial design was based on a French chateau in Courance, which was built in 1635. So Wren's inspiration in the first drawing was based on an early 17th century building. And a later building of Wren's is actually quite similar in terms of the H-plan style. So this is the chateau at Courance. Now, Wren visited France in 1665 in the year of the plague, and of course it had a profound influence on him as an architect. Basically, his philosophy as an architect was to draw upon European examples in an English context And this, he mentions courants in his notes on that visit of 1665. So this seems to be the source of the original idea, which, as you can see, is H-plan in a slightly different way, but is brick and stone construction. This is Marlborough House, which, if you walk down the Mall towards Buckingham Palace and you look through the trees, you can see it there, though it's been altered. It's had a new story put on it. But this was as it was built in 1711, which has striking similarities in terms of the sheer frontage, the H-plan design, but clearly differences in the decoration. So, the Bible most of us use when we're struggling to interpret a building is Nicholas Pevsner's The Buildings of England. This was first published in 1960. Pevsner went with that view, though not as extreme as the uppity backward architect, but slightly more conservative than Wren was his view. Whereas the second edition, which was edited by Elizabeth Wilson, she says perhaps it's more Baroque than Wren. So you've got two quite different views on this style from Pevsner, which I think is quite interesting. However, it seems to me that this squabble over the decorative style of the front of the building is actually a secondary issue in terms of Wren's innovativeness and the significance of this building. And that's what I want to try and show you more clearly. So this is a virtual reality simulation of Wren's original design by colleagues at De Montfort University in Leicester, who did this for the foundation. Okay, so first the entrance is here, whereas as you can see now you either come in the front or the side of the building. This layout is fairly similar to what we have. However, this is the radical thing. This is the schoolroom, which has these long wooden benches on each side, which was a quite new type of design for a schoolroom. Okay, so at the heart of the building, the schoolroom, we have this very new style of classroom arrangement, and I'll show you some of the evidence for this shortly. And this is completely neglected. In all the discussion over the style of the front elevation, there is no mention of this core design feature which we find on the original drawings of Christopher Wren. So this schoolroom was a central part of the design for this school proposed by Christopher Wren. Now, as I said, Sir John Moore was a merchant in London. He was very involved with Christ Hospital, which was a school in the city of London, near St Paul's, which catered for poor children in the city of London, particularly those who didn't have parents. And he was involved in this, and in fact was president of Christ Hospital for 20 years, the School of Governors. Now, just prior to his involvement with Wren in this school here, he involved Wren in the construction of a writing school at Christ Hospital in London. So Christ Hospital was in an old monastery, the Greyfriars Monastery in London, which of course was appropriated during the dissolution of the monasteries and later became a school. And this is the writing school that Moore paid for and Wren designed. attached to Christ's Hospital School. And this is the frontage of the building here. So you have a brick building, again with stone decorative elements, and you have an arcade and a cornice at the top and along here. This cost a lot more money than the school here at Appleby. It cost near £500,000. But the reason for that was that it was twice as big. So this schoolroom is 50 feet long. The Christ Hospital schoolroom in the writing school was 100 feet long. And we have this extraordinary picture of the writing school at Christ Hospital, showing where the origins of this type of layout and design came from, with long benches and writing tables for the pupils to sit at. And it was designed for 336 pupils. So this is mass education. And mass education for what? I think a lot of the discussion about the writing school is confused in that it sees writing as a basic early skill in terms of children's education. But in fact, at this time, that was usually called an English school rather than a writing school. So the elementary education, reading and writing, was in an English school. And you can see these are not youngsters at these desks. They are teenagers, and they're learning something which is different. And I think we need to look a bit more closely at what that is. And the best summary of it is given by Leigh Hunt, who was part of the Romantic group of poets, friend of Byron, who was a pupil at Christ's Hospital between 1791 and 1799, so at the end of the 18th century. So he was present at the school 100 years after it had been built. But it was thriving, and he says this: the writing school was for those who were intended for trade and commerce. And then you had a separate school at Christ's Hospital School. The grammar school was designed for people who were going to church or to the university. The writing school was designed for commercial education, which is not surprising, coming from a merchant such as Sir John Moore. It was large, and we've seen it's a big schoolroom with hundreds and hundreds of pupils at it. And it was kept distinct from the grammar school. So here's the contrast that we need to look at. Eton was run as the type of traditional grammar school, preparing people for the church and other types of occupation. Eton had a schoolroom built a couple of years before that writing school at Christ's Hospital. It was built 1688 to 1691. Now again, this is one of, you can see the building, so this is the building here, arcades, brick and stone, parapets, etc. So there's a lot of argument about who to attribute this building to, but the point is there is no concrete evidence of Wren's direct involvement in this, though there is evidence of craftsmen associated with Wren who were involved in the building of this, the upper school in Eton. So this is a case where maybe it was built without Wren's direct involvement, but from that period. And this cost £275,000. Now this is the inside of the Eton upper schoolroom, built 2 years before Christ's Hospital Writing School. It's completely different. There is no desk in sight. There are pupils sitting on benches or moving around. But the point is that the style of education here was verbal or reading. It wasn't about sitting at a desk drawing and writing. And so these are roughly contemporary, these schoolrooms, but this is the old grammar school style of education which still persisted even in new buildings at the time, whereas the writing school was offering something different. So it's very difficult to find much contemporary research and discussion about this, but I've dug into some older texts. So this is an encyclopedia of education from the 19th century, and so they stated, well, what spun out of what was originally just writing was teaching bookkeeping. And so the development of trade and commerce at this time encouraged the need for instruction in commercial subjects. And so this accounts for the development of this type of schooling. And they say, well, actually, if you hadn't had new schools or schoolmasters doing this, the grammar schools might have had to change, but they were very reluctant to change. And so this was the solution. So let's come back to Appleby. The English School by Malcolm Seaborn is the best study of how buildings have been designed for education over the years. So there were three schools in Appleby: the English School, which was designed for elementary education; the Latin School, which was the grammar school type of education; and this main schoolroom, as we've seen, was designed for a writing school type of activity. The Appleby School was designed probably for about 80 pupils, but it was written down in the specification for Appleby School that it was for calligraphy, i.e. elegant handwriting, and accounts to fit the pupils for trades or callings. From what I can see, the school at Appleby was highly unusual in trying to combine these three types of education. The charitable, if you like, an elementary education for the sons and daughters of farm labourers in the rural setting; commercial, a writing school for people who were either upwardly mobile or people who were sons of the gentry; and the conventional, the Latin school, for those who wanted to seek more conventional occupations. And so the key innovation for the Appleby School was this commercial education with the new focus on writing and accounting, with a bookkeeping desk as the physical expression of this. And so this new business school room, this was funded by the merchant John Moore, and it was designed by the architect Christopher Wren. Yes, so what happened to that schoolroom with those benches? Well, in 1861, the school split up into just a grammar school and an English school, and the writing school was abolished. In 1888, the writing desks were dismantled, but they've been repurposed as this oak wainscoting around the room. So basically, these are the desk tops, these panels here. These are the frontage before the knees, and these are the benches that the pupils sat on. So it's what's around this room which has survived from that original innovative writing school layout. And have a look afterwards. There's a lot of graffiti on these desktops. Some of it is high-class graffiti, which I think reflects the achievements of the calligraphy when it was taught in the 18th century. There's some cruder stuff, which is later 19th century graffiti. So this is the earliest picture that we have of this schoolroom from about 1905. And so you see this has got all the oak desks around the room. But there's a clue in this room which I want to pursue now to explore a bit more about the significance of this new type of education. This is John Moore in his alderman's outfits, and he's looking down here on a map. This is a map of the British Empire, and it's here that we can find some interesting insights into the motive forces for the emergence of this new style of education and new type of schoolroom. So this is the Navy League map produced at the height of the British Empire early in the 19th century. And it shows, of course, areas of colonization and settlement: Canada, in North America, India, in Asia, and then the Caribbean and the African Gold Coast as well. And basically, the period we're talking about in the second half of the 17th century, the empire did not yet exist, but there were three institutions which were laying the foundations for that empire, and they were joint stock companies, and they were the East India Company, which was dealing with trade to India and the Far East, the Royal African Company, which was dealing with this trade between the African gold and slave coast and the Caribbean sugar plantations, and the Hudson's Bay Company, which was promoting fur trapping and importation to England. These were forerunners of the modern corporation. They were joint stock companies, so they'd de-risked investment, which was very effective in enabling growth of trade. But they were only permitted by royal charter and agreements. And the three senior royal figures spent a lot of time championing and promoting these joint stock companies. Charles II was associated closely with the biggest and most successful, the East India Company. James Stewart, Duke of York, who later became James II, the King's brother, he was the governor of the Royal African Company for 20 years. And Prince Rupert, Charles II's cousin, was the principal driver of the Hudson's Bay Company. So one could regard the 17th and 18th centuries as a commercial revolution which preceded the Industrial Revolution, which we're more familiar with at the end of the 18th and into the 19th century. And this was a revolution in Britain's global trade. But a key step change in this global trade occurred between 1660 and 1689. In other words, the first 30 years after the Restoration. And of course, both Wren and More lived through this period. That was the main context for their careers. So More, for example, he was a director of the East India Company for over 30 years, between 1670 to 1702. He was the second largest shareholder, and being a director of the East India Company didn't mean that you simply turned up occasionally to hear a report on how the business was doing. Its board of directors met at least twice a week, and More attended these meetings for 30 years. So this was hands-on directorship. More, through his position in the East India Company, was essentially in control of the lead trade, not just now in England, coming down to London, but being exported from London to India. Again, this isn't very commonly known, but in fact, although wool was known, woolen cloth was one of the main exports of the East India Company. Lead was a major export, and they used this as ballast on the way out, sold it in India, and then stocked it with goods to return. So the reason More became so rich was he was at the key point in that external export of lead. And if you look at some of the accounts, I mean, some of the shipments of lead in today's value were hundreds of thousands of pounds at the time. I mean, that was the value of the lead on one ship going to India. And they were sending perhaps 20 or 30 ships a year. So that's the explanation for his extraordinary wealth. More was also involved for a period with the Royal African Company, which was responsible for the export of manufactured goods to the African coast, shipping of slaves from the African coast to the plantations in the West Indies and then shipping sugar back from the plantations to England. We've tried to explore what his involvement was. He was again active as a director for about 3 years. It didn't fit with his main interest in the lead trade, but it seems to have been associated with the East India Company declaring war on the Mughal in the Mughal Empire, Aurangzeb. And so there was no trade with India for this period in the 1680s, and it looks as though More was involved in redeploying some of the East India Company ships to the Royal African Company trade at this point. Okay, now here's Christopher Wren's business career, which perhaps is more of a surprise. More was a merchant after all, whereas Wren was an architect. But actually Wren was also involved in the joint stock companies. He had £140,000 invested in the Hudson's Bay Company stock, and he was a director of the Hudson's Bay Company between 1679 to 1684, which again was a hands-on directorship. This wasn't just occasionally turning up. This was more than twice a week meetings, and in fact the minutes show that Wren often chaired the board meetings if the deputy government was absent. So this was active, hands-on involvement in the growth of international trade through a joint stock company. So if one looks at Wren's writings then, it becomes much clearer that this practical involvement in trade and business was linked with a general enthusiasm for commerce and for what was going on in England's massive expansion of international trade at this time. So in terms of some of the material he wrote for the Royal Society, drafts and addresses in the 1660s, hardly anything is worth our consideration that will not itself advance profits. Companies, the joint stock company connects multitudes through mutual commerce for wealth and plenty. We need to increase commerce by useful inventions. We need to extend the boundaries of empire as well as those of arts and sciences. So in other words, Wren shared with More a belief in the merits of the expansion of business activity in this period. So it seems to me odd, given this enthusiasm for commerce and Wren's direct involvement in it, that it doesn't figure in most of the accounts about Wren's architecture. It tends to focus on the following clients: the church, St Paul's, but then of course the 50 or so churches in the City of London, the Crown, the Palace at Hampton Court, the Greenwich Hospital, Chelsea Hospital, big, grand commissions for the King, and colleges. He did architecture consistently for Oxford and Cambridge. This is Trinity College, Cambridge. So most approaches to Wren's architecture ignore the commercial side. So it seems to me that this school actually has some significance in offering the only surviving link to Wren's innovative writing school architecture. The Christ Hospital Writing School was demolished in 1907 to make way for the General Post Office, so it has long disappeared. It still exists as a school, but it's now outside London rather than in the City of London. I've told you the scale of these schoolrooms, and they certainly seem to have functioned for at least 100 years from their origin through the 18th century. And broadly, you could say that together the Appleby and Christ schools educated perhaps 10,000 writers, the clerks, for these joint stock companies during this period. So they played a role in providing the key staff for the growing businesses of the commercial revolution. So some recent histories of the East India Company have emphasized the importance of writing to the success of the company. So Philip Stern defines it as a critical technology of the East India Company. Letters, correspondence, journals and other forms of writing were the basic sinews of the East India Company's network. Writing was the basic means by which the East India Company leaders envisaged and conceptualized their global system. The 17th, 18th century equivalent of modern communication networks, digital technology, internet, was writing using ink on paper as a form of communication, but it needed skills to do that effectively for a business context. Another history by John Kay of the East India Company puts it as follows: paperwork was everything. The largest class of junior staff were known as writers. The East India Company lived by the ledger and was ruled with the quill. So the writers were seen as core staff to enable the thriving and success of these joint stock companies. Like this building is a link with the past, there's a building in Calcutta, in India, which also provides a link. And this building is called the Writers' Building. It was built by the East India Company in 1780 because the activities were expanding so much and the East India Company was taking over the actual running and governance of India. So this, if you like, was the bureaucracy that it needed to install in order to do that. And the Writers' Building in Calcutta still stands today. It was extended in the 19th, 20th century. It's now the home to Bengal state government. It's been the site both of many protests when the British still ruled India, but also since then. So we started off with showing the differences in background and approach of Sir John Moore and Christopher Wren. But I think we've ended up with actually identifying features that they shared in common, although they were such different people and came from such different backgrounds. They both had a strong belief in expanding England's global commerce. They both had careers which I haven't really gone into here, but they were careers based on the reconstruction of London. Its destruction in the Great Fire in 1666 meant that there was a huge amount of building to be done for the next 30, 40, 50 years. Wren designed a lot of that building. Moore supplied a lot of the lead for that building. Every new church that went up in the city needed a lead roof. So they both thrived during that period of reconstruction. I think this is quite important because although they came from opposite sides of the religious and political spectrum, which is how the 17th century is usually discussed in historical terms, Cavaliers and Roundheads, Royalists, parliamentarians, for both of them it wasn't central to their approach to life. They were more interested in commerce and business and doing things than in rerunning some of those traditional types of conflict. They ended up working together on the Christ Hospital governors, as I've said, ultimately to develop this new style of business education. So Moore became president over a 20-year period, but Wren was involved following the Great Fire because Christ Hospital, which had been a thriving school in the Greyfriars Monastery, was badly damaged during the Great Fire, and Wren was involved from the beginning in advising and helping its reconstruction. So I think that's the end of my story for today. It seems to me there's a good case for us to write a new story about 17th century education architecture. This school, this building, I think provides an architectural window into the origins of business schooling in England. It reveals forgotten innovations in the content and purpose of education and how we could actually design the schoolroom. These made a significant contribution to the spectacular growth of the global trading joint stock companies during the commercial revolution. It's really only possible to make sense of this story if you engage in a full and honest account of these companies in the development of colonialism and the rise of the British Empire. I mean, that is the role they played historically. And I think there's a need to involve school pupils who have links to all parts of that global network of places and buildings in Calcutta, the Gold Coast in Africa, Appleby Magna in England. In other words, the places touched by these English writers of the 17th century to write that story together. So I think this is a good opportunity to write a meaningful and relevant story for the 21st century. Thank you.